During World War II, Germany teamed up with several nations, each bringing their own strengths, weaknesses and reasons for joining the fight. From Italy's shaky commitment to Romania's tough sacrifices, these alliances shaped how the war played out for the Axis. But these partnerships weren't always smooth. Misunderstandings, mismatched priorities, and cultural clashes often led to tension. Still, there were moments when German soldiers found respect and admiration for their allies and even their enemies on the battlefield. Let's look into how German soldiers really felt about their allies and enemies during the war. The United States' entry into World War II came later than other major powers, but when it did, it brought massive industrial strength and manpower to the Allied side. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the US rapidly mobilized, building a powerful military machine almost from scratch. This sudden and huge buildup of troops, tanks, planes, and supplies was something that German commanders noticed right away. However, their initial perception of American forces was mixed and often underestimated. German soldiers and officers tended to view American troops as less experienced and not as disciplined as their own or even British forces. They often attributed American successes to the sheer volume of equipment and resources at their disposal, rather than to combat skill or tactical prowess. Colonel General von Arnim, who faced American forces in Tunisia, expressed this view when he remarked that American soldiers tended to panic under pressure and retreat quickly. He believed that their victories were more about overwhelming firepower than effective fighting, suggesting that American troops lacked the grit and experience needed for prolonged, hard-fought battles. This perception was shared by many in the German military, who thought that American soldiers were not accustomed to the harsh realities of the European front. One of the reasons for this view was cultural misunderstanding. German soldiers were trained under a strict, hierarchical system that emphasized discipline, endurance, and tactical knowledge. By contrast, they saw American troops as casual, less disciplined, and more relaxed. American soldiers often approached their service with a different mindset, one that was more informal and less rigid, which Germans mistook for a lack of seriousness. This led to a stereotype that Americans were not as committed or capable, a view that would be challenged on the battlefield. Major battles like the Normandy invasion, D-Day, and the Battle of the Bulge would serve as turning points in how Germans perceived American forces. The successful landing at Normandy in June 1944 showed that the Americans were capable of planning and executing a massive, complex operation under challenging conditions. While the invasion was supported by overwhelming Allied air and naval power, the determination of American troops to push inland despite facing tough German resistance was something that caught German commanders off guard. The Americans' ability to adapt and keep moving, even when plans did not go perfectly, was a quality that began to change some German views. Another major shift occurred during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The Germans launched a surprise offensive, hoping to split the Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. Initially, they believed that the American lines, composed mainly of new and less experienced troops, would break under the pressure. However, American units, despite being caught off guard, managed to hold key positions and slow down the German advance. The defense of Bastogne, where American paratroopers refused to surrender despite being surrounded, became a symbol of American resilience. German commanders, who had expected a quick victory, were forced to reassess their opinions about American fighting capabilities. They realized that the Americans could withstand difficult situations and bounce back, showing a level of resolve that they had not anticipated. Despite these turning points, the Germans continued to see American success as largely due to industrial success, mass production of tanks, planes, and weapons that allowed the US to overwhelm its enemies. There was some truth to this. American factories produced more tanks, aircraft, and supplies than any other country, which gave them a major advantage. But this view often led Germans to overlook the adaptability and tactical learning that American units displayed as the war went on. What started as a less experienced army quickly learned from its early battles and grew stronger, something that many German officers did not fully appreciate until it was too late. The clash of cultures between German and American troops also played a role in how they perceived each other. While the German army was rigidly structured, the American forces were more open to improvisation, which sometimes worked to their advantage, especially in chaotic situations. This misunderstanding of American strengths and weaknesses led to a tendency among Germans to underestimate their enemy, a mistake that proved costly as the war progressed. However, as the war reached its final stages, American troops demonstrated that they could endure and adapt, proving themselves on the battlefield. For many German soldiers, this shift was a surprise, revealing that the Americans were capable and resilient fighters who could not be easily underestimated. Chapter 2. Honourable Foes. The reluctant respect for the British soldier. The rivalry between Britain and Germany had deep roots, going back to World War I when the two nations clashed on the Western Front. By the time World War II began, this rivalry was still strong, but it had evolved. While there was animosity, there was also a sense of mutual respect, especially among the soldiers on the ground. Both sides had experienced the brutal trench warfare of World War I, which set the stage for how they viewed each other in the next conflict. German soldiers generally respected their British counterparts for their discipline, toughness, and combat skills. Many accounts from the front lines describe how German troops saw British soldiers as worthy opponents who rarely backed down and maintained a strong fighting spirit even under pressure. The British were known for their orderliness and precision, qualities that Germans could relate to given their own military traditions. German officers often remarked that if you dressed a British soldier in a German uniform, you might not see a difference in how they carried themselves on the battlefield. However, while there was respect, there was also criticism, particularly towards British leadership. German officers frequently viewed British generals as overly cautious, hesitant to take risks, and slow to seize opportunities. For instance, during campaigns in North Africa and Europe, German commanders like Erwin Rommel noted that British forces would often prepare carefully, but would hesitate at key moments, failing to capitalize on strategic openings. This tendency led to a perception that, while British soldiers were capable and brave, their leaders were too careful, which sometimes made British operations less effective than they could have been. The most famous example of this was the Battle of Dunkirk in 1940. While the British managed a massive evacuation, allowing more than 300,000 troops to escape across the Channel, German commanders believed it was due to British caution rather than skill. They felt that British commanders focused too much on defence, missing chances to counterattack, which allowed German forces to gain the upper hand. Despite the impressive rescue operation, German views on British leadership were shaped by what they saw as missed opportunities on the battlefield. Beyond the tactics and strategies, there was a cultural element to the British-German rivalry that made it distinct. Unlike the harsh ideological struggle between Germans and the Soviets, or the bitter resentment towards the Americans, the rivalry with the British had a different tone. There were cultural similarities that brought a sense of familiarity between the two sides. Both nations valued discipline, tradition, and a sense of honor in combat. This connection often showed in how they conducted themselves during battles. Even when fighting fiercely, there was a level of respect, with reports of truces during certain times like Christmas, when soldiers from both sides would stop fighting briefly. The cultural parallels also extended to how they viewed the war. Both German and British soldiers were often portrayed as professional, focused on their duty rather than driven by deep hatred for the other side. This was very different from the intense ideological battles on the Eastern Front, where the conflict was marked by extreme brutality and animosity. It was a rivalry defined by professional respect, making it one of the more unique and complex relationships of the war. Chapter 3. The Spanish Legionnaires, the Blue Division's stand on the frozen front. Spain's involvement in World War II was unique compared to other Axis-affiliated nations. Officially, Spain under Francisco Franco remained neutral throughout the war. However, Franco sympathized with Hitler's cause and allowed a group of Spanish volunteers to fight alongside the German army on the Eastern Front. This unit, known as the Blue Division or Division Azul, consisted of about 50,000 Spanish soldiers who fought against the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1943. Although not a formal part of the Axis, Spain's participation showed support for Germany without dragging the country fully into the war. Franco's decision to send the Blue Division was a political balancing act. On one hand, it allowed him to repay Hitler for the support he received during the Spanish Civil War, particularly from the German Luftwaffe's Condor Legion. On the other hand, it allowed Spain to maintain an official stance of neutrality, avoiding direct conflict with the Allies. The Spanish volunteers, who were mostly anti-communist and saw this as a chance to fight against Bolshevism, were integrated into the German army as the 250th Infantry Division. They served under German command, but retained a sense of Spanish identity, keeping their own ranks and language. German soldiers had a high regard for the Spanish volunteers. They were impressed by their bravery, resilience, and adaptability, especially given the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. Unlike some other Axis allies, the Spaniards seemed to embrace the challenges rather than shy away from them. German officers praised the Blue Division for their fierce fighting spirit and sense of camaraderie. Despite being volunteers with less formal training than regular German troops, the Spanish soldiers proved themselves to be tough and resourceful, earning respect from their German counterparts. One of the most notable examples of the Blue Division's determination was their role in the Battle of Krasny Bor in February 1943. The battle was part of the larger siege of Leningrad, and the Spanish found themselves facing a massive Soviet offensive. Despite being heavily outnumbered, with Soviet forces attacking with more than 4 times the manpower and tanks, the Blue Division managed to hold their positions for several days. Their fierce resistance helped slow down the Soviet advance and gave the German forces time to regroup. The bravery displayed during this battle became legendary, and even though the Spaniards eventually had to withdraw, their actions left a lasting impression on the German command. Throughout their time on the Eastern Front, the Blue Division showed a sense of unity and brotherhood that was recognized and appreciated by German soldiers. Unlike other Allied units that sometimes struggled with coordination and discipline, the Spaniards operated with a strong internal cohesion. This was partly because they were all volunteers, motivated by their shared cause against communism, and also because they were allowed to maintain their own cultural identity within the German military structure. Franco's public support for the Blue Division also played a role in their perception. In February 1942, after the German retreat following the Battle of Moscow, Franco made a statement expressing his admiration for the Spanish volunteers. He even went as far as to say that if the road to Berlin were opened, it would not just be one division but 1 million Spaniards who would march to fight alongside the Germans. This kind of support was a morale boost for both the Spanish volunteers and their German allies. However, these promises were never fully realized. While Franco's words were strong, he avoided sending further divisions, careful not to escalate Spain's involvement in the war. As the tide of the war began to turn against Germany, he became more cautious, ensuring that Spain would not be dragged into a losing conflict. The fact that no additional divisions were sent did not go unnoticed by the Germans. While the Blue Division continued to earn respect for their dedication and combat skills, there was a sense of disappointment within the German military that Spain did not offer more direct support. As Germany's situation became more desperate, the limited Spanish involvement was seen as a missed opportunity. Yet, despite this, the Blue Division's contributions were remembered fondly by those who fought alongside them. Their decision to volunteer and the spirit they brought to the front lines set them apart from many other Allied forces. The Blue Division was eventually withdrawn at the end of 1943, as pressure from the Allies mounted on Franco to distance himself from Germany. Even after their official departure, some Spaniards chose to remain on the Eastern Front, joining other German units as individuals rather than a separate division. This showed their deep commitment to the cause they believed in, even when their government had stepped back. The Blue Division may not have been the largest or most well-equipped force on the Eastern Front, but their bravery and camaraderie left a lasting impression on the German soldiers they fought alongside. Chapter 4: The Eastern Bulwark, Romania's Sacrifice and German Respect. The alliance between Germany and Romania during World War II was built on a foundation of strategic necessity, particularly on the Eastern Front. For Germany, having Romania as an ally meant securing valuable oil resources from the Ploiesti oil fields and gaining a vital partner against the Soviet Union. For Romania, the alliance was seen as a safeguard against Soviet expansion, which was a constant threat. This partnership was solidified when Marshal Ion Antonescu came to power in September 1940. As a leader who believed that siding with Germany would protect Romania, Antonescu led the country into a close alliance with Hitler's regime, even sending Romanian troops to support the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 2008-1941. Antonescu's decision to ally with Germany was driven by his belief that Romania's best defense against the Soviet Union was to stand with a powerful military partner. He was convinced that if Romania did not support Germany, they would face Soviet aggression on their own, which would be disastrous. After meeting Hitler in November 1940, Antonescu pledged Romanian support for the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. From then on, Romanian forces fought side by side with the Germans, particularly in Ukraine, Crimea, and other key areas on the Eastern Front. From the German perspective, Romanian troops were seen as brave and reliable allies, especially in the early stages of the Eastern Front campaigns. Despite having less advanced equipment compared to German units, the Romanians displayed a strong fighting spirit and were willing to make major sacrifices. German soldiers and officers often described them as tough, resilient, and fully committed to the cause. In some cases, Romanians were praised for their effectiveness, particularly during the early successes of Operation Barbarossa, where they played important roles in capturing Soviet positions and advancing into Soviet territory. One of the best examples of this cooperation was during the Siege of Odessa in 1941, where Romanian forces fought fiercely alongside the Germans. The battle was tough, with strong Soviet resistance, but the Romanians held their ground and eventually helped capture the city. It was a major achievement that earned respect from their German allies. Throughout the Eastern Front campaign, Romanian troops continued to participate in major operations, including the battle for Crimea and the advance towards Stalingrad, often suffering heavy casualties. Almost 500,000 Romanian soldiers would lose their lives during the war, showing just how deeply involved the country was in the Axis war effort. However, there were challenges in the partnership. Romanian forces, despite their courage, struggled with outdated equipment and logistical issues. Many Romanian units were not as well equipped as their German counterparts, which sometimes led to problems during coordinated operations. German officers noticed this gap and believed that if the Romanians had better weapons and supplies, they could have been even more effective. But overall, the Germans appreciated the dedication and willingness to fight that Romanian troops brought to the battlefield. The alliance was not just about military cooperation. Germany depended heavily on Romanian oil from the Ploiesti fields to fuel its war machine. Protecting these oil fields became a priority for both nations. The Ploiesti oil was so important that it became a target for Allied bombing campaigns. German and Romanian forces worked together to defend the region, building extensive anti-aircraft defenses to keep it operational. The turning point in the alliance came in 1944, as the tides of war changed. The Soviet Red Army had gained momentum and was pushing westward, reclaiming lost territories and advancing towards Romania. By August 1944, the situation had become critical. The Soviet forces entered Romanian territory, and it was clear that they had the upper hand. At this point, the Romanian leadership made a fateful decision that would change the course of their alliance with Germany. King Michael I of Romania, in a dramatic move, staged a coup against Marshal Antonescu on August 23, 1944. Antonescu, who had been the main architect of Romania's alliance with Germany, was arrested, and Romania switched sides, joining the Allies. This sudden change of allegiance was a severe blow to Germany, as it meant the loss of a major ally and exposed the southern flank of the Eastern Front. The German leadership was caught off guard and felt betrayed, as they had relied on Romania for both military support and vital oil supplies. The swift Romanian defection allowed Soviet troops to advance into Eastern Europe more quickly, accelerating Germany's defeat. From the German perspective, the Romanian decision to switch sides was seen as a betrayal, even if it was understandable from a strategic point of view. The loss of Romanian support was a major setback, and it marked the beginning of the end for German operations on the Eastern Front. German soldiers who had fought alongside Romanian troops were shocked and disappointed, especially since they had seen their allies as brave and committed during the earlier years of the war. Chapter 5. The Hungarian Allies, an Uneven Partnership. Hungary joined the Axis powers by signing the Tripartite Pact on November 20, 1940, aligning itself with Germany, Italy, and Japan. This decision was largely driven by Hungary's strategic interests. The country hoped to regain territories it had lost after World War I, and aligning with Germany seemed like the best way to achieve that. The alliance brought Hungary into the war, but the relationship was not as smooth as the Germans might have hoped. At the beginning, the cooperation between Germany and Hungary had a sense of familiarity. During World War I, the two nations had fought as allies within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this historical bond carried over to some extent. However, by the time World War II began, the military capabilities and strategic needs of both countries had changed. German soldiers and officers quickly realized that Hungarian forces were not as effective as they had hoped. Many Hungarian units struggled due to a lack of proper training and outdated equipment, which became more evident as the war dragged on. German commanders found it frustrating because while Hungary was committed to the Axis cause, their contributions were often seen as less reliable compared to other allies. Part of the problem was that Hungary's military had not been modernized to the same level as Germany's. Their equipment was often outdated, and they lacked the kind of rigorous training that German soldiers went through. This difference in military readiness was a source of tension. For example, when Hungarian troops were deployed alongside German units on the Eastern Front, they often found it difficult to keep up, especially during fast-moving operations. German officers noted that while Hungarian soldiers showed courage, they were not always prepared for the realities of modern warfare, which sometimes led to disorganization and setbacks during key battles. One of the most important moments for the Hungarian-German alliance came during the latter stages of the war, particularly during the Siege of Budapest in late 1944 and early 1945. By this time, the Soviet Red Army was advancing into Eastern Europe, and Hungary had become one of the main battlegrounds. The Germans relied heavily on their Hungarian allies to hold the line and defend key positions, especially in Budapest, which was under threat of encirclement by Soviet forces. The siege was brutal, with both German and Hungarian troops trying to hold off the Soviets in freezing winter conditions, facing a numerically superior enemy. The Siege of Budapest was a turning point that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Hungarian forces. On one hand, the Hungarian soldiers, alongside their German counterparts, fought desperately to defend the city, showing determination and bravery. The city's defense lasted over 100 days, making it one of the longest and most intense urban battles of the war. However, the struggle also showed the issues that had been present throughout the war. Hungarian units were poorly equipped, lacking sufficient ammunition, tanks, and heavy artillery to effectively counter the Soviet assault. The German troops noticed this and realized that, despite their Hungarian allies' willingness to fight, they simply did not have the resources to match the Soviets. In the end, Budapest fell, and the loss marked a major blow to both Hungarian and German efforts on the Eastern Front. Beyond the battlefield, there were also cultural and strategic differences that affected the alliance. While Germany's military approach was based on strict discipline, detailed planning, and rapid movements, Hungary's strategy was shaped by its own political and military limitations. Hungary's leadership under Regent Miklós Horthy was not fully aligned with Nazi ideology. While they cooperated with Germany, there was a level of caution and reluctance that sometimes made coordination difficult. Horthy himself was uncomfortable with some of Germany's policies, especially those related to the treatment of Jews, which led to a complex and uneasy partnership. This tension grew as the war turned against Germany, and Hungary looked for ways to limit its losses. As the war progressed, the strategic value of Hungary diminished in the eyes of German military leaders. Initially, the alliance had been useful for Germany, particularly because of Hungary's geographical location and its potential to act as a buffer against Soviet advances. However, as the Red Army continued to push westward, it became clear that Hungarian forces, without significant German support, could not hold back the Soviet tide. The fall of Budapest was a clear indicator of this reality, marking the beginning of the end for Hungary's participation in the war on the side of the Axis. Hungary's alliance with Germany was one of necessity rather than equal partnership. German soldiers recognized the courage of their Hungarian counterparts, but were often frustrated by their lack of modern equipment and training. The realities of the Second World War showed that Hungary was not fully prepared for the demands of a modern, large-scale conflict. Cultural differences and strategic limitations further complicated the relationship, making it an uneven and ultimately strained alliance. Chapter 6. Masters of the Snow. German praise for the Finnish winter warriors. Finland's alliance with Germany during World War II was built on a shared enemy, the Soviet Union. Unlike other Axis powers, Finland was not formally part of the alliance. Instead, the cooperation resulted from a mutual need to fight against the Soviets. Finland had already fought the Red Army in the Winter War, 1939 to 1940, where they displayed fierce resistance despite being outnumbered. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Finland joined the fight, seeking to regain lost territories in what became known as the Continuation War. German soldiers had deep respect for their Finnish allies, who were known for their toughness, adaptability, and combat skills. Finnish troops excelled in harsh winter conditions, a factor that often crippled other armies on the Eastern Front. German officers praised them for their ability to operate effectively in freezing temperatures, deep snow, and dense forests. The Finns' skills in skiing, camouflage, and winter survival allowed them to move swiftly and carry out operations that larger, less prepared forces struggled with. This earned them the nickname Winter Warriors and set them apart as reliable and resourceful allies. The roots of this admiration went back to the Winter War, where the Finns managed to hold off the Soviet advance through effective guerrilla tactics. They used their knowledge of the terrain to launch surprise attacks, cut off Soviet supply lines, and quickly disappear into the forests. These hit-and-run strategies were highly effective, especially in the snow-covered landscapes of Finland, and caused heavy Soviet casualties. The Germans recognized these tactics as clever and efficient, and they saw the Finns as resilient fighters who could make the most of their limited resources. The alliance between Germany and Finland was unique. Unlike other Axis countries, Finland kept a level of independence, cooperating with Germany without committing fully to the Axis cause. This practical arrangement suited both sides. Finland focused on regaining its lost lands, while Germany benefited from having a capable ally on the northern front. Finnish troops played a key role in protecting the northern flank during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa, often coordinating effectively with German forces to capture Soviet positions and disrupt supply lines. One of the most notable aspects of Finnish combat was their endurance. The harsh winters on the Eastern Front were challenging for most armies, but the Finns were well prepared. They had developed techniques and equipment over the years to handle extreme cold, and German troops often relied on their Finnish allies for support and guidance on how to survive and operate in these conditions. Whether it was building shelters or managing supplies, the Finns showed a level of competence that impressed their German counterparts, who were not as used to such environments. However, the alliance had its limits. As the tide of war shifted and the Red Army advanced, Finland sought a way out. By 1944, Finnish leaders realized that they needed to make peace with the Soviets to avoid occupation. This led to an armistice, which required them to turn against their former German allies and expel them from Finnish territory. Though it was a difficult decision, it allowed Finland to preserve its independence and avoid total Soviet control. The German-Finnish partnership was marked by mutual respect and practicality. German soldiers admired the Finns for their adaptability and skill, especially in winter warfare, and valued their ability to conduct guerrilla tactics that were highly effective on the Eastern Front. While the alliance was less formal than others, it proved to be one of the most efficient collaborations, built on necessity rather than politics. Chapter 7. The Pact of Steel, a Fragile Brotherhood. German Views on Italian Soldiers. When thinking about World War II alliances, the partnership between Germany and Italy stands out as a very important but shaky connection within the Axis powers. This alliance was formalized with the signing of the Pact of Steel on May 22, 1939. It was meant to be a military and economic agreement, committing both nations to help each other if war broke out. Yet despite this formal bond, the alliance was far from smooth, facing issues like logistical problems, different military strategies, and varying levels of readiness. The relationship between German and Italian soldiers was filled with misunderstandings, frustration, and a sense of imbalance in commitment and skill. At the time of the Pact of Steel, Both Germany and Italy were getting ready for possible conflicts, but they had different timelines. When Adolf Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, France and Britain quickly declared war, and Europe was pushed into full-scale conflict. Italy, however, was not prepared to join the fight. Mussolini had promised Hitler that Italy would be ready for war within 3 years, but in 1939, Italy's military was still under-equipped, poorly organized, and facing supply issues. Because of this, Italy did not officially enter the war until June 10, 1940, nearly a year after it had begun. This late entry did not sit well with German soldiers and commanders. They were disappointed, seeing Italy's lack of readiness as a sign of weakness and unreliability. Mussolini's decision to finally join the war came with the hope that Britain would soon be defeated, but that did not happen. Instead, Italy got dragged into a long conflict it was not prepared for, which strained the relationship between the two Axis powers even more. From the start, German soldiers had mixed feelings about their Italian counterparts. As the war went on, these views became more negative. Germans often thought of Italian forces as lacking the same level of commitment, discipline, and effectiveness. Reports and personal accounts described Italian troops as being reluctant to engage in combat and quick to surrender when faced with strong resistance. A common saying among German soldiers was, 130,000 Italians are worth the same as perhaps 10,000 Germans, showing how they saw a big difference in combat skill. There were several reasons behind these opinions. Italian units often had outdated equipment, not enough training, and weak supply lines, which affected their performance on the battlefield. Stories spread among German troops about Italian tanks raising white flags, and there were jokes that if Italians invaded southern Germany, they could be held off by the elderly and the Hitler Youth. While exaggerated, these comments showed the general disappointment German soldiers felt toward their allies. One example of German frustration was during the North African campaign. Italian forces fought alongside the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel, but they were often seen as not pulling their weight. Rommel himself had mixed feelings. He sometimes praised Italian bravery, but more often complained about their lack of preparation. Italian units had serious shortages of food, water, and ammunition, which made it hard for them to fight effectively. German officers, who were used to a more disciplined military setup, were shocked by what they saw as a lack of organization and drive among Italian troops. Despite the mostly negative perceptions, there were exceptions that German soldiers noticed. Some Italian units earned respect for their courage and skills, especially when fighting in tough situations. The Folgore Parachute Division is one of the best examples. This unit fought bravely during the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1942, holding their ground against much larger British forces, despite being outgunned and outnumbered. Their determination impressed both their enemies and their German allies, who respected their effort. Another exception was the Italian Navy, particularly their submarine crews and frogmen, who carried out daring attacks against Allied ships in the Mediterranean. These specialized units, operating under tough conditions, gained a level of respect that was quite different from the general disdain for Italian ground forces. Some German commanders believed that the main issue with Italian forces was not the soldiers but their leadership and equipment. They thought that if Italian troops were under German command, their combat skills could improve significantly. For example, during the North African campaign, there were integrated units of German and Italian forces that sometimes showed better coordination and success, though this was not always consistent. It was not only the Germans who were critical of Italy's military performance. British and American officers who fought against Italian troops shared many of the same views. Reports from the British Eighth Army often described Italian soldiers as willing to fight, but held back by poor equipment, weak leadership, and inadequate supplies. Some British officers even said that Italian soldiers were defeated before they ever got to the battlefield, not because they lacked courage, but because of the conditions they were in. There were also moments of mutual respect between opponents. British accounts from the North African front mention that when Italian forces were properly equipped and motivated, they could put up a tough fight, especially in the early stages of the war. However, these moments were rare, and the overall impression remained mostly negative. The difficult alliance between Germany and Italy can also be traced back to deeper cultural and strategic differences. Germany's military was known for strict discipline, precise planning, and quick, coordinated attacks, things that often clashed with Italy's more relaxed approach. While German soldiers were trained to work efficiently within a tight system, Italian forces leaned more on improvisation, which could lead to confusion during joint operations. On top of that, Germany's military industry was far more advanced than Italy's, giving German troops access to better weapons, vehicles, and supplies. This gap meant that Italian soldiers often had to fight with outdated equipment, which only reinforced the German belief that their allies were ineffective. Many German officers thought that Italians could perform much better if they had the same resources, but wartime demands meant this was rarely possible. Chapter 8. The Relentless Red Army, from underestimated enemy to unyielding force. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, it was the largest invasion in history. Hitler and his commanders believed that they could quickly crush the Soviet Union, expecting a swift victory similar to their earlier conquests in Europe. The German High Command underestimated Soviet strength, thinking the Red Army was poorly led, under-equipped, and no match for the disciplined and experienced German forces. At the start of the invasion, this confidence seemed justified as the Wehrmacht made rapid gains, capturing vast areas of Soviet territory and encircling thousands of Soviet troops. Many German soldiers thought the war on the Eastern Front would be over within a few months. However, this initial perception would change as the war went on. While the Red Army suffered heavy losses in the early months, they did not collapse. Instead, they regrouped, rebuilt, and learned from their mistakes. The harsh Russian winter also played a major role, slowing the German advance and exposing their unpreparedness for fighting in extreme conditions. The Soviets began to show a level of resilience and determination that the Germans had not expected. German soldiers started to realize that the Red Army was a poorly organized force and was facing an enemy that was willing to endure extreme hardships, make huge sacrifices, and keep fighting no matter how severe the situation was. One of the turning points that changed German views of Soviet strength was the Battle of Stalingrad, which began in the summer of 1942. Initially, the Germans were confident that they could take the city, which was a strategic industrial hub. The battle, however, turned into one of the bloodiest confrontations of the war. Soviet forces, despite being heavily outnumbered and suffering massive casualties, fought ferociously, turning the ruined city into a maze of deadly street fighting. For months, the Germans were slowed down in brutal combat, unable to break the Soviet defenses. When the Red Army finally launched a massive counteroffensive in November 1942, it encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting off their supplies and forcing them into a desperate fight for survival. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the German belief that the Soviet Union would eventually give up. Another important moment that changed German perceptions was the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. This battle was the largest tank engagement in history, with both sides amassing huge armored forces. The Germans planned to cut through Soviet defenses in a decisive pincer movement, hoping to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets, who had learned from previous battles, were prepared. They built extensive defensive lines and used new tactics to counter the German armored assaults. The result was a devastating defeat for the Germans, marking the end of their offensive capabilities in the east. After Kursk, German soldiers knew they were no longer fighting an enemy that could be easily outmaneuvered. The Soviets had proven themselves as capable, strategic, and relentless. Germans came to see the Red Army's willingness to suffer and sacrifice as almost inhuman. Soviet soldiers would launch frontal assaults, endure freezing conditions with little food or shelter, and fight to the last man rather than retreat. Stories circulated among German troops about Soviet commissars executing soldiers who tried to retreat. Despite the harsh realities on the battlefield, this perception evolved into a grudging respect. German soldiers learned that underestimating the Soviets was a mistake that could be fatal. They began to see the Red Army not as a force of sheer numbers, but as an army that could adapt, learn, and strike back with devastating effect. By the end of the war, many German commanders admitted that the Soviets had outperformed them in ways they had not expected, through a combination of strategic planning, mass mobilization, and unwavering resolve.